Robert Francis poured while seated at his table and lit by a tiny bedroom lamp. It was 10:30 p.m., and he was making notes on a map whenever his gaze landed on a subject of interest. And he believed that he could avoid the early traffic and catch the first flight if he left at 6 in the morning. His schedule called for taking the train to Malawi and then cycling to Aberfoyle village, arriving in a few hours. And he was thrilled about the prospect of going on vacation at last. It had been 11 months since he had even taken a day off from work, so the idea of riding a bicycle for 8 days straight, to be honest, it was thrilling to be in the Scottish wilderness alone with his tent and rucksack. He had several motorcycles. However, he would choose his most trusted and beloved for this excursion, with a special paint job that reads Rob in huge. It was a bike with white letters on a black frame that had never let him down, not even a bump or bruise. Robert woke up excited after puncturing his tire in the morning, beginning the day deliberately navigating the city's little traffic with glee. Before he knew it, he was leaving the train in Malawi and traveling over peaceful country roads in the direction of. It was cooler than Robert had anticipated. And Scottish summers are famously unpredictable, but he didn't give a damn as he drove over the vast countryside, passing the odd vehicle or rural home. A grin appeared on his face. Robert was in his element and cycling was his love. As the sparse but rolling green hills gradually gave way to a more majestic and completely different landscape, a few hours went by. Striking scene, with a few hills that quickly turned into imposing mountain pockets of soon. Open roads and dense, visually impenetrable trees replaced the woodland, quickly gave way to their less trodden and narrower equivalents, and it wasn't long before a pleasant view of the settlement of Aberfoyle appeared, with a steep rise on one side and charming cottages, and in the distance a broad, open plain that stretches out into a mountain range. A little Robert's gut churned with excitement as he realized that Aberfoyle was the final sign of humanity he wanted to witness. The following 8 days, and after leaving it behind, he would be genuinely alone and free to unwind it in Queen Elizabeth Park, one of Scotland's largest parks, was the next stop on the serene splendor of the Scottish countryside. After stretching his legs on the natural reserves, he entered the actual wilderness that it contained. Robert started the final portion of his trek for the day within the oddly empty Aberfoyle main street. He left that tiny, harmless town and into the unknown for a few minutes. He had been struggling for the last 3 months to decide where to go on his adventure, but when he passed an old stone bridge with a rumbling creak underneath that sounds like 1,000 voices pleading for help, were confronting himself with a forest that stretched as far as the eye could see, enveloping the hills, mountains, and valleys like a blanket. A dirt road sliced through the landscape, indicating that he had made the proper choice. Tangle of trees, and as Robert rode his bike farther into the reserve, he realized with every mile that the massive pine trees on either side covered the sun. It appeared as though light itself was an unwanted guest around 600 as the sun began to set over a range of jagged mountains on the horizon. Robert knew it was time to choose a suitable campsite for the night. He persisted in his struggles, searching his surroundings for a suitable place to camp over rough hills and sections of muddy mud. He eventually located a climbing through some dense underbrush and tangled shrubs in a little clearing in the woodland near the road. There was a tiny patch of grass where Robert was able to push his bike over the tree line and into the clearing. The area trees that Robert believed had initially created the clearing were scattered with a number of fallen trees. He found a level area of grass and pitched his tent there for the night. Getting some dry wood close by, he excitedly built a campfire using some lighter fluid, and one of Robert's favorite things about camping in isolated places was using matches to construct fires. He frequently believed that there was a characteristic of the arsonist, but he kept it to himself for his forays into the wilderness, and in any as darkness fell. He was cautious not to damage nature because he loved it. After sitting next to them for a few hours, the stars shone boldly and brilliantly, unhindered by man's artificial light. Robert grudgingly went to bed, thrilled by the thought of another day, to the warm glow of the fire. Early in the morning adventure, the fire was still burning, and Robert felt more relaxed and rejuvenated. Compared to what he had done for years, he packed his things and made sure the fire was out. Started off once more. Fortunately, there had been some light rain during the night. After riding for an additional hour, Robert observed that the road was comparatively dry, but the surrounding area had changed. The trees appeared more closely spaced and less tidied, and any sporadic openings in the landscape of the woodland was made up of little fields and clearings that had clearly been neglected for many years. Robert came to the realization that he had ventured deep enough in the forest to be beyond the scope of even the park rangers who would typically keep such a location where it appeared the land had been abandoned by its. For some reason, carers were tempted by the idea that even people who knew the wilderness were scared to go there. The sky turned grey as the day went on, capturing people's attention for a brief while before being swiftly written off as a passing fad. After he pushed his bike up a steep incline, it became evident that a significant amount of rain was imminent. Thought was too crooked to ride on, but as Robert reached the top, a panorama stretched out in front of him, between areas of woodland and still, stuck puddles of water that slept in a deep, flat valley below for kilometers. The earth was covered in patches of lush, colorful grass that occasionally gave way. Robert made the decision to head to the forest's roving edge with rain in the horizon, that not 30 minutes later, he would camp early in a broad swath of grass he could see at the base of the hill. He was there, the tent was up, and the only thing left to do was gather firewood, because starting a fire was crucial. Moving as fast as they could since the blood, feeding Scottish midges were out in force, and that the only issue was that Robert had chosen a camping area where grass predominated, which would assist spread them. Bushes and shrubs rather than trees. Therefore he would need to walk a short distance across the valley and collect from one of the forested areas close to a group of pine and fir trees that appeared to form a solitary woodland island. His camp was sufficiently close, perhaps half a mile wide, and after 10 or 15 minutes walking slowly over the lush, green grass, occasionally stepping unintentionally on the remains of a marsh, Robert was at the edge of the trees, and the bog underneath him was nature's own burial shroud, dominated by ancient trees that had long since withered and were coated in thick brown hanging moss. The ground was covered in rotting, open trunks of once beautiful, majestic pines and sycamores. Robert saw that these woods were like a poor wounded animal inside, appeared out of place in some way. The trees didn't fit in with the scenery like the tall grass did. Observed that the whole region appeared to narrow out and turn from a healthy natural green to a horrible yellow. As Robert pondered this idea with a growing feeling of inexplicable fear, he came to the realization that he was observing a sizable dead ring of grass that exactly encircled that pocket of trees by following the tree line. Many would have been wary of the woodland, which appears to be outlining the boundaries of a tomb on their own in a remote area of the world. Of such a sight. But Robert soon overcame his first alertness, finding the place to be an interesting phenomenon. And he boldly crossed the woodland threshold into the faint light within on. He could see numerous remnants of old trees scattered around the forest floor. But the wood was soggy that it seemed to had been at the bottom of a river for a long time, and Robert reasoned that dead wood farther into, as the canopy above became thicker with each step, the region would get drier. Sheltering below, Robert looked up from searching the floor in the rain and became aware that he had traveled pretty deep into the interior of the woodland. In fact, the trees there were now in daylight, obscuring the sun from the sky, and he would have swore if he hadn't known better. Finally, around twilight, he discovered a bunch of dried logs and broken branches. It was getting harder to make his way through the trees, so Robert realized this was as far as he should go, which appeared to be getting closer together, their branches frequently touching and overlapping as though attempting to maintain those. Within from running away from what was a dumb idea, Robert grinned to himself. It had begun to rain, and although he could hear the water dripping from the leaves above, everything around him was flawless. Since everything would be damp until it was dry, it made sense to return and build a fire as soon as possible. He swiftly collected the remaining wood into his arms, since it would become more and more difficult to do so. But as he turned to depart and followed his own footsteps on the pine floor, something drew his attention in those eerie woods. His eye was blocked by a ring of trees a few feet away, especially near one. Another seemed to be an odd configuration of stones on the ground, and Robert, being Robert, had merely after scuttling his way through a web of branches, he discovered he was gazing at hundreds of irregular grey stones the size of a fist that appeared to be a burial, and some much larger ones had been stacked on top of each other, roughly 3 feet broad, 7 feet long, and a few feet apart. A chill went up Robert's spine when he noticed that the earth appeared to have been marked by a mourner. He briefly felt as though he was being watched, but he quickly got over this terrified state when he noticed a number of empty beer cans were among the haphazardly strewn items surrounding the stones. A sleeping bag with newspaper shreds and a sweatshirt coated with rotting leaves was scattered on the floor. Even some discarded food cans revealed the tome to be someone's. Robert sighed in relief as he arrived to the campsite and deduced from his surroundings that some pupils had likely arrived here in the summer, got caught in the rain, and had to stay in the woods. The stones were most likely merely left there out of boredom or even as a practical joke to frighten away any future onlookers. Robert reflected briefly on the wonderful university summers, recalling summertime excursions, where he found the stone formation intriguing, but his pause had one thing to say about it. On the side of the pile, between two simple grey pebbles, there was a stone that seemed to be noticeably unlike the others. It was triangular in shape and wider than a human hand. It was somewhat smooth, resembling black marble, and tapered off to a dull point at one end. Before Robert dropped the firewood, leaned forward, and pulled at the stone after giving it some serious thought. Felt cool and polished in his palms, but it didn't seem to want to leave its house. Growing a little frustrated since it was wedged so tightly among the other boulders, Robert encircled the stone with both hands, and after a vigorous jutter backwards, it was when I looked at it closely, it appeared disturbingly similar to the head of an old axe. Regardless, Robert was ill-equipped to respond, but appeared to be a man-made object, and he saw chisel marks on its side. Possibly the campers who came before them had discovered it close by and used the rock-in. Robert was thrilled by the prospect of their creation, unaware of its importance. And he knew that on he would ask a friend who had studied archaeology at university if it was what he wanted to do when he got home. Suspected after looking at the item for a while, but the sound of the rain overhead reminded Robert that he actually should return to his encampment. Putting the stone in his pocket as he stooped to get the firewood, but as he did so, he heard a sound that seemed to be the sound of a stone sliding off the pile. Fell on the ground. A nagging feeling of worry began to steadily take hold of Robert. Despite his anxieties, he swiftly shifted the firewood while leaving the other stones in place. It started to return. Something deep inside him with each step was informing Robert that someone was indeed following him in the woods and that he was no longer alone. But every time he looked back, he saw nothing. On a few occasions, he even entertained the idea that he could hear pines and twigs breaking beneath his feet. But once more, nobody was. They sighed with relief when the tree line appeared. and Robert was ecstatic to see that he would be back in the open in a short while, but he heard a crack just before he got to the edge of the woods. Once more, it was evident that this time it was louder, more noticeable, and he was certain someone was standing close behind him, as shown by the hairs on the back of his neck standing up in unison. Staring at him from a few feet behind, torn between terror and the fear of knowing without knowing, Robert gently turned around and saw it for the first time. Briefly, but he caught a glimpse of something vanishing behind a tree, maybe an arm or a shoulder. Robert's heart began to pound deep inside his chest, and his mouth became dry, making it difficult to swallow. Then, he started to backpedal and hop carefully in the hopes of avoiding tripping over an invisible root or weed on the ground. The foliage lightened with each step, leaving him exposed on the earth, and as it approached its edge, the outside light cast a bluish hue throughout its innards. Never took his eyes off the massive sycamore trunk that appeared to be hiding that mysterious person. It was strange, yet his thoughts were overwhelmed by an overwhelming sense of safety outside. Normally, a person feels vulnerable and exposed in the untamed wilderness, but Robert, at least not, when he gently made his way to the grassy plain outside the delicate, a crescendo of noise was created by the ominous sound of leaves rustling and swaying, almost angrily, but there was no there. There was only one conclusion to be drawn. There was no breeze to disrupt the wind gust. He heard something and then emerged from the trees. Far from Robert was not being stalked by whatever had been following him. You could not afford to be a superstitious man when camping by yourself in such isolated areas, since the mind has a tendency to play tricks that transformed the harmless sounds of nature into something far more sinister. But he didn't want to remain long enough to see who his uninvited woodland friend had been dropping everything except the... Robert raced as quickly as he could, thinking that the strongest piece of wood would make a decent homemade weapon, toward his own camp, while continuing to look back at that peculiar island of trees with dead grass all around them. Yet nothing came out of them. Robert, breathless and irritated, packed up his things at his tent as soon as possible, he carried his bike up a hill and returned to the dirt road, not pausing for another second. Rode quickly and vigorously in an attempt to put as much distance between himself and the odd residents of that place as possible before locating a more secure and hospitable location for camp. The road was now nothing more than, every time Robert's bike sped past an uneven depression in the ground, a single trail of mud drenched him in a shower of dirt. The temperature was exceptionally bitter for the season, and the rain was now accompanied by a freezing. Every step forward felt like 100 Roberts as the wind whipped his cheeks. Tried to keep moving forward as long as he could in the hopes of avoiding having to set up camp until the final usable ray of sunlight. But a few hours later, the sky opened up even more and it started to rain, fell in sheets, forcing him to seek cover. And Robert quickly came to the conclusion that he had placed at least 15 or so kilometers of challenging, meandering terrain separate him from that strange forest of trees. Whether it was sufficient or not, it was just not conceivable. Due to the weather conditions, there was a pretty steep drop on the left side of the route that led down into a vast field. But it wouldn't offer Robert the cover he knew he needed for his. After his bizarre experience from the right, a modest gradient of grass rose up into another wood. He had previously shown some reluctance, but he again rejected this as absurd. And after pulling, it took a while for the raging rain to filter through the tree canopy as his bike climbed through the meadow and entered the forest. Before Robert could find a good place to camp, he discovered a big bush beneath numerous densely knit firs. Trees. He set up his tent there because it was still comparatively safe from the terrible weather outside. He was able to make a small bonfire with some dried roots, grass, and forest floor twigs, which allowed him to prepare several meals while boosting his morale as nightfall approached. and as the sound of sausages sizzling in a frying pan over a fire was muffled by the wind and rain. But it was the first impression of contentment and well-being he had felt since the morning. As he reflected on his experience in, Robert started to make sense of what had happened in those woods after discovering a sleeping bag and other possessions. Clearly, he had just disturbed a number of things, including clothes, food, and beer cans. A neighboring camper, who undoubtedly grew alarmed upon witnessing another person straying from their campsite in. The man must have been in the middle of nowhere, and he was certain it was a man based on what little he had seen of him, and he most likely huddled behind that tree out of fear. Or frightened Robert let out a breath of relief, but he slipped as soon as he did. His palm touched the chilly black surface of his jacket pocket. The peculiar stone he had picked up from that assortment of strangely arranged rocks had entirely slipped his mind. Robert took it out of his jacket pocket and examined it in the dim red glow of the flame. Convinced that it felt old and ancient, having been molded by human hands. But he would hold off on raising his hopes too high until he spoke with his friend, who is an archaeologist. But he would have to acknowledge that since he was a young boy, the prospect of discovering a relic from the past has excited him greatly. His love with exploration may have been influenced by his constant obsession with obscure or unexplored history. Stories and traditions of weird and forgotten places abound in the Scottish countryside. Above all else, he hoped it was of a mystery Pictish provenance. Historians continue to wonder about the disappearance of indigenous people more than 1,000 years ago, and wonder over it was most likely a contemporary reproduction. But the romantic aspect of Robert's personality liked to entertain the hope that it was much more. Something strange started to dawn on him as he gazed at the relic. Something distinct above there was a rustle of a wood's animal close, the crackling sound of the fire, and the now subtle wind. Robert couldn't determine how far away it was, but it reverberated across the surrounding valleys and ridges. Scattering, with only a little pause in between words, it repeated itself over and over through the trees in the darkness. Was a description of an animal that Robert might not have recognized. Even though he was quite knowledgeable with the area wildlife, the sound had odd animal traits. Unbeknownst to him, it sounded somewhat like a bird of prey, screeching and high-pitched. But this made a miserable sound that was more like a fox howling in the middle of the night to find its. It sounded like it was searching for something, and that was precisely what it was. Young, as whatever was making the screaming sounds moved, Robert remained awake for the next 3 hours, listening to ebb and flow. Closer, then farther away, till he finally fell asleep. He reasoned that the sound's motion was similar to that of a search team shouting and yelling after a clear search for someone who is lost in the woods. Now in the chilly daylight, the sound had vanished, and although Robert had come to terms with what had frightened him before, yesterday, he was just a shy camper wary of a stranger around, and he was still plagued by a sense of impending. The day went very swiftly, and he had a tremendous sense of dread. Robert made good improvement, but not with the delight. Previously, he displayed a hazardous substance in his. Something choked his mind just outside of his consciousness. Ghost that night, he set up camp in a clearing once more, and the same in search of something lost. A terrible wail screamed throughout the wilderness. One small change from the previous night was that something precious screamed, and sleep did not arrive. Easy again, and Robert thought that he had heard footsteps close by during the night, but he ascribed them to the simple nightly explorations of a solitary stag or deer. During the next day stayed drab and dreary, and the rain and wind had vanished. Both a faint recollection, yet despite the sporadic buildup of water on the dirt track, Robert continued, navigating a network of trails. But he discovered that he had deviated from his planned course at some. At this point, he was certain that he knew where he was, that the change would only be a minor detour, and little more. At times, when the earth was sufficient to halt him, he made tremendous progress. Occasionally, to observe a range of rising peaks and deep valleys, unusually, though he avoided the woods and woodlands as much as possible, which frequently accompanied the road, but he dismissed it as a figment of his imagination, feeling as though it was late afternoon and something inside of them was watching from the shadows. Robert was starting to feel exhausted, most likely as a result of a disturbed night and the relentless pace. He had made a mental note throughout the day that he was still somehow escaping. Something about the course he'd been following for the last few hours had been rather predictable. But now it turned abruptly around a grassy hill to unveil a shift in the terrain that had been obscured from view, for a dense forest of trees was traversed by a lengthy stretch of dirt and an even track. The path was remarkable to Robert since it was unusually straight, and he thought it was strange because it was terrifying because it was so small, just a few feet across, that you could touch both with your arms extended wide. Sides of the woodland, this closeness evoked the most sensations of overexposure, and if Robert had been a soldier in a combat zone, he would have pointed out this lengthy, winding route as an ideal location for an ambush. Standing a short distance away with his mountain bike from the start of, he was uncomfortable with the state of affairs in both the woodland and the track because it was obvious that the way was the only path ahead. And even if it seemed to leave the woodland a few kilometers later, Robert could not tell, but he sensed that there was something fundamentally suspicious about it. Sensed that he didn't want to go through it, and after assessing the advantages and disadvantages, he discovered that both the method he arrived and he was apprehensive about the unknown region ahead, so he ignored the feeling of fear as a figment of his hyperactive imagination and proceeded slowly along the long, straight track in the hopes that a black overcast hung overhead, allowing Robert to swiftly enter and exit the jungle without any problems. Excessively uneven terrain as soon as he could. The sensation of bowing that he had so casually discarded started to. He kept his head down as the ferment in his stomach rose through his body, making the hairs on his arms stand on edge. Mostly, but occasionally looking ahead at what he thought was his departure in the distance just over halfway down the route. All he wanted to do was get through and out of there as soon as possible. He was overcome with an uncomfortable and unwanted familiarity that had been with him for days, but now appeared. Robert's thoughts were always occupied with the desire to be more acutely aware of his nerves, and the sensation of being watched, pausing briefly to gather his breath and doing his best to dispel the unwavering awareness that he wasn't alone. The road ahead, and as is typical of people who try to cross a threshold or attain a goal mindlessly, he looked back to gauge with his own advancement. He had successfully traversed a significant portion of the track's length and was certain that in a short, he would eventually get out of that small area of dirt. But when he turned to go on as he continued, Robert noticed something farther down the trail ahead of him and instantly regretted taking it. Following the path he had selected, he turned around and headed home, and there was an unmistakable, and a stranger stood a distance away in the direction he was going, completely paralyzing him. Because they were standing out to the side, Robert was unable to fully define or distinguish the person's subtle features. Along the trail between a stand of shadowed trees, although this was most definitely not his, while Robert was far away, he had the impression that someone was standing there observing, and that the presence of the figure was nearly upon him, its gaze accompanied by a particularly strong sense of well-intentioned hate, was the best way Robert could explain it to himself before it vanished back into the woods. But the sense of peril and the need to escape did not. The sound of something moving amongst the trees echoed over the landscape, diminishing or declining but intensifying. Robert turned and cycled in panic as the emptiness grew louder. He was eager to get out of the small passageway that was guarded on all sides, so he moved as fast as he could in the direction he had come. He failed to see a deep hole in the ground because of the dense forest, and his bike's front wheel collided with the robot, was sent flying over his handlebars and scratching the ground due to a depression. For a few period, he was stunned by the shambling sound of displaced leaves and shattered branches that was almost upon him, pulled Robert's thoughts into focus as blood seeped from a leg cut and even though his arm was severely injured from the blow, his only concern was getting out of that confining path. Robert's favorite paint job across the engraved letters, RO, on the bike's surface appeared to being moved by someone in the woods. Frame had sustained minor scratches in the collision, but he was unconcerned about it. The bike's front tire spokes were broken, which was definitely the last thing Robert wanted. Totally stuck there, so he would need to ride cautiously and hope the wheel wouldn't buckle for an extended period of time. Sufficient to transport him home, which was just where he planned to go as fast as possible, and since he was now facing the way he had been going for days, there was no time to waste. As Robert cautiously and at pace traversed the broken ground, the sound of the trees' movement persisted. Despite his apparent speed advantage, he fervently prayed that his reliable mountain bike would get him out of there. The sound appeared to be just a few seconds away, and as he approached the wooded path's end and into the open, the same wailing, tormented cry erupted from the jungle, and he heard a noise that froze him to his core. From the previous evenings reverberated, stinging Robert's ears and gnawing at his nerves like a shredder was. No human being could possibly make such a panicked noise as that figure who had been prowling around Robert's tent at night. As the pressure and strain caused his bike's front tire to shake and crack, he accelerated until at last he was out of such tight space. Yet Robert continued to ride his bike for hours on end without stopping. He only stopped to rest at night, once he was certain that his assailant could not have followed him. In hissing and suddenly every sound, scent and component of what had always been, the once inspiring scenery took on a new, sinister and threatening figure. He made the decision not to set up camp tonight. No tent, no fire. Robert was certain that the noise and light he had created from the object had allowed the person following him to do so. It would be unpleasant from night to night. It would be chilly, damp, and uncomfortable. However, Robert wanted to ensure that he could not be followed because the area had a number of trails and dirt tracks that he could have taken. But ideally the man who was following him would be unable to do so for whatever reason. Naturally, Robert realized that if his pursuers were astute enough, his tire tracks could readily reveal where he was. The bike marks were clear enough to follow them. So Robert veered slightly off course to try to confuse anyone who could be following him in case the worst happened. Could do would be to find a big bush with room underneath it to sleep, which was close to where his tracks terminated. Robert spent the night hiding in his bike with one question: far enough from where his tread traces ended. He must have wondered if this stalker could follow his development every day. Sleep did not come at all when I was riding a bike or any kind of vehicle, but where were the tire tracks? Night, but that terrible, horrible noise started to move around 3 in the morning. Robert was starting to feel the effects of his lack of sleep and rest by this point. But despite this, he swiftly pulled his bike out of its hiding spot as soon as dawn appeared and began his once more. There was not a single unpleasant sound or indication that anywhere a stalker was present. Robert's anxiety was overcome by reason as night once again, after settling in. He traveled a lot during the day and took the best possible care of his bike. Robert concluded that the front wheel, with the exception of the occasional creak or moan, was operating perfectly. A great deal of introspection that he had let himself become overwhelmed by the seclusion of his environment and the undoubtedly unsettling individual he had spent the last few days seeing in the wilderness. But undoubtedly, It was absurd to think that he was actually being followed. Perhaps the person he had seen was not the same as that weird island of trees. Perhaps it would be more reasonable to assume that it was just another camper. The noises were caused by a couple of them, and the strange animal's nighttime howling was... There must just be a local bird species that he had never heard of before, so Robert would light a campfire that evening. He would prepare his meals, eat healthily, and take pleasure in the isolated countryside as he had long planned to do, arranging his vacation after finding a good location in the forest. This is he did just that, cooking over a raging bonfire and spending hours staring up at the night sky through the... There were no sounds or odd shrieks coming from the tree branches above. There are no shambling footsteps in the dark, and there is no assurance that he is not welcome. Robert returned to his tent, exhausted and in dire need of a well-earned rest after his traveling buddy was abandoned far behind. After sleeping for 2 more hours, Robert awoke to the sound of activity outside his tent. Since he didn't want to spend another night in the dark, he had left the campfire blazing, and it appeared to be to move and change form in the night air, creating shadows everywhere. One shadow in particular is cast across Robert's tent's thin canvas like a naturally occurring movie screen. Robert halted as he saw the shadow of someone seated by the fire. His mouth dried up, and his breathing became labored, and he was unable to comprehend how foolish he had been to convince himself that no one was pursuing him as he started a new fire, and he had guided them straight to his sleeping quarters, giving them the advantage. After a moment of complete terror, Robert recognized that God knew what they desired, had to pull his sleeping bag off and get up gently in order to defend himself. And then, as silently as he could, he looked around the tent for something he might eat as a weapon. A metallic lamp, the weight of everything in his rucksack, and the wood he had foolishly left a glass bottle at Sever that he had taken days ago. He scolded himself outside the tent for being so careless, and could hardly think that although he usually kept his suitcase inside, protected from the weather and the elements, he had left it outdoors. The sole reason was animal fatigue, but that did nothing to improve his current situation, so he recalled the black rock, an ancient axe head he had discovered at the unfamiliar camp. Indeed, it might still deliver a terrible, possibly lethal blow if it was a hand axe. As he thought Robert calmed himself as he ran his fingers over its once sharp ridges, never fortaking a moment to see over the fire's shadow on the tent wall. He noticed that the door was fortunately unzipped, but the outer fly sheet's 2 flaps were hung over the opening, blocking one eye's vision. Slowly, he peered through the gap between the 2 canvas flaps and saw that someone was seated at. Robert was positive it was a man based on his physique, by the campfire and the backlight of the... Although it was challenging to discern any of his features due to the flames, it was evident that his shoulders were large and muscular. This man appeared to be wearing rags of material that hung loosely, suggesting that he had been in the desert for a while. Long strands of black, wet hair were all over his head, clumping together in what appeared to be. Robert looked at the back of the man's head and did his best to wash it, because it hadn't been washed in a while. Control his fear, believing that he could theoretically approach him from behind and strike him in the back to knock him unconscious. The black stone to the skull, but that might constitute murder, and Robert wasn't even sure if the man was violent, was a traveler, gypsy, or itinerant kind, so perhaps waiting was best. Perhaps he would simply go into the woods, but that didn't seem likely. As Robert confirmed he promised himself that he would charge out into the open and engage the man in head-on combat if he attempted to approach the tent. Observed anything strange about the man's posture. First of all, that he was sitting. He was so motionless that you could have mistaken him for a statue. Not even the smallest movement was created, and there was absolutely no sign of life. Not even a slight change in weight, breathless rising and falling. But this stillness was The second thing that disturbed Robert the most was that the man was sitting with his back to him. The fire, but his head and upper body were positioned and shaped strangely. They didn't appear to quite. His body appeared to be positioned strangely, and the flames crackled, followed by an errant flash of light that showed the truth. The region was briefly illuminated by flames. Even Robert's tent was illuminated by the light that bounced off trees and reflected back onto the surroundings. Yes, the man's legs were facing the night, and for a brief while, specks of light shone through dark clusters of matted hair. Fire, but his head and body were cruelly twisted into an awful shape. The man's head and body were facing the flames, while his legs were actually facing the... He didn't know how long he had been sitting there waiting in that tent, but Robert was no man at all. Robert was frightened enough to leave the tent and head into the woods after hearing a trickle of movement from its neck. Deep enough to be compared to madness, and he had no idea how long he had been running or whether he had been yelling the entire time, but his feet sustained multiple cuts, and the first, in the distance, Robert could see rays of sunlight piercing through the forest's still thick limbs. His campfire was still burning brightly, and even though he was terrified that he was being followed by, for a while, he had to get to his bike to stand a chance of escaping something completely inhuman. His nerves were completely broken, so he hid behind trees and shrubs. Refusing to Robert was a powerful character, but his senses were altered by going near that fire. When eventually he regained his calm, and as he approached his own camp cautiously, the entire area was now illuminated by daylight, and he could see whatever had been sitting by that fire staring at him. After considerable introspection, Robert made the decision to gather his things, take his bike, and move forward as fast as he could on his. Everything had to be in order as they left Queen Elizabeth Park, and Robert even gave himself permission to smile. The smile quickly disappeared when he saw his bike, at least since it was considered that the creature wasn't a robber. Unharmed, sure, but the front and seat were covered with a strand of some black, full liquid. Wheel was still functional, so there was no need to worry about sludge on his bike at this moment. If it had happened a week earlier, Robert would have been upset at his beloved's smallest scrape. Mountain bike, but now his only concern was returning to Aberfoyle village or home. Civilization. Robert cleaned up the fluids, packed up his tent, and then proceeded as quickly as he could. Given a strong push, Robert could leave that terrible spot in a day and a half, provided he took short breaks and rode for as long as there was light. The weather wasn't perfect, but it did rain. Sometimes it emerged, but it vanished swiftly, allowing long portions of the trip to be free of the wear and tear caused by the Robert's discomfort increased throughout the day as he felt overwhelmed by everything. Sides as though he were fleeing a dreadful thing, but he was getting closer to an unknown threat, a frightening revelation. What if the beast followed him home? This idea swelled up in his subconscious, swirling around in his mind. He crossed a hill's crest and descended once again, before abruptly recognizing what was amiss, and a hole in the ground appeared before him, with pockets of stagnant water, which explained why he was so anxious about what was ahead. The terrible island was situated in the middle, surrounded by extensive grass and patches of marshland. Robert first saw his pursuer in the woods, a place of wretchedness. Then everything suddenly made sense, call it blindness or superstition. Robert was aware that he did not want to face that twisted man again because, as a child, he had ghost stories about individuals disturbing graves, and ghosts of the dead appearing to torment the living have been related to him. But he never gave such matters any thought before today. But he was aware that he had unintentionally started the entire horrifying affair by taking something that wasn't. Robert went toward that remote area of woodland after concealing his bike in the high grass. He was now aware that a burial lay missing, one strangely shaped black. While there were several odd things, Stone partly anticipated that object to be sitting next to its resting location. Robert thought his unwanted visitor was still out there, since he could hear sounds and movements amongst the trees. He eventually located the cemetery that had an extended pattern of stacked. After finding the gap where he had ripped the black stone from Robert, he proceeded to gather boulders and stones, pushed it back in as firmly as he could. But Robert didn't want to hang after hearing a disturbance coming from the opposite side of the trees. Ran as quickly as he could across roots, mud to see what it was. He leaped from that shadowy area into the open outdoors, surrounded by fallen branches and leaves, and had a sense of achievement and complete relief. It didn't take long for him to return to the dirt path and continue on his bike to find another spot to spend the night before returning home. And the next day, a burden had been removed off. He was aware that he had unintentionally disturbed something unthinkable on Robert's shoulders. Impossible, but by giving back what he had taken, he had just managed to avoid what he thought would have been a horrible fate death, or much worse. This feeling had no known cause. He simply knew in his heart that he had read his share of joy and survival. Unfortunately, it was dark when Robert laid in his tent that night, because he had chosen not to campfire just to be sure, but he was sure he would be left alone, and he found tremendous solace in anticipating the following day and the satisfaction of knowing he was secure. For a man who had always loved the countryside, the idea of home was amusing, hating the monotony of everyday city life and anticipating a nice bed, a couch, a TV, and a beer next every year. He would take a vacation to a sunny resort and spend a few weeks lying on the beach. Ideally far from his country. Robert grinned as he closed his eyes and listened to the noise he had, after being heard outside for so many nights. They abruptly yelled and screeched at a terrifyingly loud pitch without Robert had to open his eyes to realize that the noise was not coming from the trees. Robert Francis was never seen or heard from again after emerging from the tent. Scotland is an ancient country with a secret history of long-forgotten people and places, yet maybe some traces of stays remote and solitary in the acrid wilderness. So if you ever want to, when you explore this ancient country's hills, forests, or lochs, keep one thing in mind. If you come across a pile of stones that resembles a grave and are around by mementos of food cans, a camping bag, or even an antique bicycle bearing the name Rob carved it into it, proceed without turning around and without touching anything, whether it's, above all else, a plain piece of forest wood or an odd black stone. Never take a keepsake, as others who lie and sleep close by might steal one from you.